G'day, it's Harry Brook, Ag Fieldman with the County of Flagstaff. Today we're talking to Rob Spencer, owner and operator of Spencer's Horticulture Solutions, also known in various fields as Rob the Hort God. He's going to be talking to us today about greenhouses. Because of COVID, there's been a lot of interest, people getting back to their gardens, and it's been going crazy when it comes to greenhouses.
You're listening to the official podcast of Flagstaff County.
So Rob, could you tell me a little bit, like what do you need to consider in first getting a greenhouse? What can you expect out of it? And what are the considerations when you go for that?
Well, there's so many different things to be considering. It really depends on what you want to do with it. I mean, if you're looking to, just give yourself an opportunity to grow some transplants to put out in the garden, or if you wanted to start some plants, or if you want to, carry things through a little later into the season, so extend your growing season, you probably can get away with just something like a cold frame type greenhouse, really small, on the ground. That's
so
fairly
you think
simple.
It's sort of like using some plastic over some frame hoops?
Yeah, you could. That can work. Again, you have to kind of keep your expectations clear. Most basic plastic and stuff's not going to give you the insulative value that you need. If you're going to put a greenhouse in place, depending on the size, again, consider how big a plant's going to get and what you can actually accomplish. Like a commercial greenhouse is going to have really big, their gutter height's going to be really high because they're trying to have quite a lot of airspace because it's easier to manage and keep things consistent in that space. Plus, they're going to have big plants that are going to grow for months and months. Whereas
Right.
you in a backyard, chances are you're going to have something that's high enough that you can walk in and then some, but not likely going to, it's not going to be massive. And so,
Right.
Recognize you're probably not going to grow year round, or if you are, you're going to have to kind of adjust how you're growing to that space. Depending on how much space you have, choose a space that's going to have good light. I often see, people buy these little hobby greenhouses and they tuck them in a corner under the trees or whatever. And you're losing the benefit of the greenhouse, which is to capture the light and light energy that's going in there.
Keep the heat in.
Well, yeah. And if you've put it in the shade, it's not going to accumulate a lot of heat and you're not going to get a lot of light, and your plants are going to stretch, and your quality of your plants is going to be, a lot poorer. So put it out, just treat it like anything else, and get that. You want to make sure those plants have as much light as possible, as much natural light as possible, simply because then you don't have to be adding more artificial light, supplemental light to make it to get where you need to be.
Gets more expensive, doesn't it?
Yeah. You do want it to be a little bit sheltered. So I said, don't put it in the shade, but make sure if it's sitting out in the open, recognize that you're going to lose more heat from the wind and other things. There are calculators that you can look at a greenhouse, and based on the material and the size and the surface area, you can figure out how much heat requirements it would have in terms of a BTU, or like if you wanted to add a heater, you'd need to know, okay, this greenhouse is this size, it's going to lose this much heat. So I need to have a heater that's going to supply, this much heat.
Okay. Would you use any insulation, like to try and, or where would you put the insulation?
You can't really insulate the top without completely blocking all the light. But on a basic greenhouse, if it's going to be more permanent in place, you might put a pony wall or something, an insulated wall along the bottom, like a few feet high or whatever, and then build the greenhouse off that. But most greenhouses, like the hoop style houses that you have, are just going to be, metal ribs and a plastic cover, and they're going to be fairly inefficient in terms of capturing heat. If you go with a double layer of plastic and insulate, like have that inflated, you do get a little bit of an insulated potential there, but recognize that you're going to have to be adding a fair bit of supplemental heat to keep things warm and growing in sort of March, April, May, and then in September and on. So
how much, I guess, to extend the growing season, how much of an extension would you get with a greenhouse? Like how early can you start and how late could you go in the fall?
Well, if you're heating it, I mean, you can theoretically, the sky's the limit. You could go all year round, but the more inefficient your greenhouse, the more the heating costs are going to be. So I say you're probably, and just without having extra heat, you're not going to get a lot of extension. You might get a few weeks on either side. If you had covers inside, you might be able to get a couple more weeks off that. Like, so you had the greenhouse and then you had covers to sort of like frost protect on the inside, maybe like laying on top of the tables or whatever. But without adding extra heat, your season extension is going to be minimal.
Okay.
I mean, you certainly add a lot of heating and whatever, but it just depends on what you're wanting to do. I mean, if you're serious about growing stuff, I mean, I would invest in the right design that has all those pieces considered. Some sort of a heat boiler or whatever, like some sort of a heater, some sort of an airflow or ventilation system, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But if you're going to just, hobby it up, just understand that, you may have hot and cold spots and you may have to run heaters a fair bit to try to keep the heat up.
Don't expect too much from it just because you've got it, right?
Yeah. I mean, you're going to learn how to manage it as best as you can, but right off the hop, you're not going to be producing hothouse tomatoes right off the go. There's a lot involved there. Commercial growers make it look easy, but it is absolutely not that way. So
what about ventilation? How important is that?
It's pretty important. I mean, we often think we want to keep things, humid and warm. We associate humidity and warmth, but it can certainly get too high. And especially if you've got, some issues with heating, you can get condensation in the inside and get a lot of sort of rain on the inside, which is, for bigger plants, they can probably handle it, but little plants are going to be a big problem. So I would say most greenhouses, especially small ones, don't have a lot of ventilation capabilities. You can either open or close the door. But if you have the ability to sort of introduce some fresh air periodically or have some circulation of air, that's good. Otherwise, just make sure that there's air moving inside. So commercial greenhouses, even the lower tech ones, will have an air tube kind of running down the length of the greenhouse, either to blow warm air from one end to the other or to just make sure that there's air moving down the length and moving through the greenhouse. Otherwise, you're going to get humid pockets that you're going to get lots more seedling diseases and foliar diseases like powdery mildew and other things are going to crop up because they like the humidity and the stagnant air, and you want to make sure there's a good mix going on. During the season when it's warmer and you can open and close things up, having that exchange of air from inside to outside, it would be good. When it's colder, I mean, even in the bitterest of cold, a commercial greenhouse, you'll see it opening and closing because they're venting to kind of keep the humidity down and to get some of the moisture out. Otherwise, the plant health goes way down. So
what's the ideal moisture content that would be in a greenhouse? Like as far as humidity?
Depends. You're definitely not shooting for, 98% and that kind of thing. That moisture in that air would be just too loaded. So the second you drop the temperature, you're going to have the water's going to drop right out of it. So I would say shoot for, you don't want it super dry. Otherwise you're going to be watering all the time. And it'd be very hard when it's cooler to kind of keep that humidity from not climbing. So I would say shooting that sort of that 60%, 65% range is probably okay. And if you can get a little drier, if possible, maybe.
So if you're going to be growing, say, tomatoes, they're my favorite. Would you be putting them on sort of in raised beds or would you have them on tables? I guess you wouldn't have them in the ground, would you?
Well, you could. I mean, certainly in a greenhouse you can. I mean, people do grow greenhouse and any type of plants in ground. I mean, the greenhouse itself becomes just the way to keep things warmer and the bounce of light and everything. So you can grow in the ground, but if you want to change things out, I would say go with a bigger pot so you have plenty of soil and growing medium mass to work with, because over time salts are going to build up and other things. If you're growing in ground, it can be quite challenging to sort of change things out and flush the water through and flush the salts through, so you can end up with building up some problems. So I mean, you can go either way, I guess. I mean, if you've got a greenhouse and you want to put them in a 2-gallon pot or something larger, you can get a bigger plant out of that. And just recognize that the bigger the plant you're going to get, the more you're going to have space for those roots to live. And in a commercial greenhouse, they're moving the plants down, and they've got they're constantly supplying nutrients and water. In a hobby type greenhouse or in a backyard greenhouse, you're probably going to work within the soil media, growing media that you have, and try not to overcrowd that with roots and plant. And so it's going to set your time limits a fair bit. And most of the plants you're going to grow are going to be within, you can probably do it in a couple 2 to 3 gallon pot for sure. Those are plenty big. I guess it depends on what you want to do. I had my tomatoes in a raised bed under a little greenhouse, and they did okay, and they got quite big. I mean, I didn't manage the pinching. I didn't. I just was happy that they were growing, and then all of a sudden they were massive, and I should have maybe given them a bit of a haircut and cut them back so they force them to produce more fruit and less leaves and that kind of thing.
Okay. What about fertility? Like, would you be fertilized at all? I guess it depends on the soil.
It depends on the soil. I mean, if you're growing in the ground, and depending on what you're growing, you might, add some back. Probably go with some sort of organic matter that way, just to kind of keep the fertility levels a little more manageable and not out of whack. Growing something like tomatoes, it's easy for them to become trees and not tomato bushes, and
not productive.
Yeah, very all top, no fruit. And so, be careful on that. I mean, I would be more inclined for any type of plant that I was growing from transplant to fruiting. I would probably be inclined to apply everything through like soluble fertilizers in the water, and have a bit in the soil through adding composted manures or organic matter, and then letting that kind of slowly release a little bit. I might add a little bit of slow release fertilizers, but not a lot. And then I would just add as I watered them, I would probably fertilize that way.
So what about the growing medium? Like, if you're not going to put it in the soil, or even if you did put it in the soil, what happens if your soil's got a lot of clay in it? Versus something
add more
that's
organic
like
matter. I mean, ultimately, if you've got it, if it's really sandy or if it's heavy clay, the best thing you can do is add organic matter, because if you've got a clay soil and you add sand, you're making concrete, and vice versa. So you really just want to add organic matter, because that's going to improve tilth. It's going to improve drainage. If it's really heavy, you might not want to go with deeper and then try to improve the drainage in that. Peat moss is fine. I would say that you're going to want to try to mix it with other stuff, so you get a little bit of variability in the sort of the sizes of the particles. I mean, peat moss can be a little bit fluffy and it's hard to re-wet, and so I like to mix it with other things. So
what about the soil pH though? With like some peat mosses are fairly acidic.
Can be, yeah, they can certainly be a bit. And I mean, ideally in a greenhouse situation, you're actually shooting for a little bit more acidic soils and growing media. So they're often shooting for the lower, like 6, like 5, 6 kind of thing. And so it's okay to have them a little bit more acidic anyways.
So why are they doing that? Is that for phosphorus availability?
But yeah, it's mostly related to different nutrient availability, but also what they're working in too. So, but they're generally trying to, they're often acidifying their growing media just to try to keep it down. Because if it gets higher, they're starting to tie up some of those micronutrients that they need really bad. But in a hobby or background situation, I would say look for something that's going to give you good contact. It's not going to be too fluffy or not too chunky, because you can get coarse mixes, or you can get really fine ones that are fine mixes are great for when you're starting seeds, but you don't want a big chunky growing media mix with when you're planting seeds in it. But you also don't want to grow a full plant in the seed starting mix. So find something that's pretty
you have to get good seed soil contact, right?
Yeah, so pick something that's in the middle of the ground that's going to give you good drainage, good water holding capacity. If you've got sort of soil that you're growing in, you're going to add organic matter. Add something that's going to add a lot of organic matter, but not make it too loose and too fluffy. Play around with it. It's going to take a little bit of monkeying around a little bit with it, I guess.
So I was just thinking here that grow pumpkins in a greenhouse. because those things spread so much, I guess you have to consider a lot what the mature plant, the space it's going to require.
Yeah, or just or accept their mature space for who they are. Accept the pumpkin for the pumpkin, who the pumpkin is, and just know that the pumpkin is going to vine out and spread out. So start it in one spot, and then just recognize that you're going to have to probably encourage it in certain directions so that you're not stepping on it and breaking off the pieces. So you can grow pretty much, like I said, anything in there, pumpkins, melons, all that kind of stuff. But just maybe you have to channel their growth. If they're going to be on a bench, that might be a little bit of a problem. If they're on the ground, it's not going to be as much of a deal. And then, be aware of different requirements. I find that you're going to find hot and cold areas. You're going to find wet and dry areas. And then when you're watering, make sure that you're not overwatering some areas and underwatering others. Pay attention to the edges. Yeah. It's really important to pay attention to the edges, not just the ones that you're close to you, but the further away ones, and that's where you watch for problems to start to occur, whether it be insects or diseases or other things.
So where the crop might be under stress, either due to too much moisture, too little moisture, that's where you're going to see the pests start.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Or close to the entrance or whatever. But if you can keep the airflow good, if you can be careful in your watering so that you're, making sure that you're not missing the edges or the corners, and that'll probably help even things out. And then if you're not over watering, soak things down until they drain through so that the salts flush through, and then, let them settle down and dry down.
So how long would you wait, or what signs would you use before you'd water them again? Would you let them dry out a bit?
I guess it depends. A little stuff I wouldn't necessarily let dry out completely.
No, they don't have
but if something's bigger, I would probably give it a good soak, and then I would leave it for a bit. Pay attention to the temperature and the other things that are happening. So if it's bright and sunny and it's super hot, recognize that the amount of moisture needing to go through that is going to be quite high, and so you're going to be watering regularly. But when it's cooler, you're probably just going to be watering, every couple of days or every week, like a couple times a week early on. Very small plants, as you're trying to get germination, you're going to be probably watering them quite often, once a day.
Would you be putting a cover over them to sort of?
You could when you're germinating. Yeah, you would probably cover them to keep it more humid, and then once they pop up, then let them breathe and wet them down. I'm just trying to think of some of the other issues that come. I mean, you can add you can replace all the natural stuff with supplemental stuff, like with heat and light and all those types of things, but you don't necessarily have to. And as you add more structure above, you've got to kind of compensate for it with the light and things. One of the things that I think people often run into is they don't realize how important the light is, and they also don't, they sort of think that the greenhouse is a complete shield from everything else. And so they don't realize that the stuff that's happening around the greenhouse definitely can impact the inside of the greenhouse. And so, people have grown a really nice, starter crop of something, and then all of a sudden they spray their weeds in the lawn, and boom, suddenly they have really strange looking tomatoes.
And it doesn't take much, does it?
No, it just takes a whiff. And so, if you're going to have a greenhouse in your yard, you might need to think about other ways of managing your weeds in your lawns and stuff like that, just because it doesn't take a lot to get a whiff of volatile herbicide and to affect some of those really sensitive plants. The other thing too is be careful what you're bringing in or even if you think that, well, there's weeds growing under the benches or whatever, maybe I need to spray those. Be careful of that, but also be careful of what types of organic matter you're bringing into the greenhouse. So, compost and manure is great, but if it's, straight out of it had a nice shot of herbicide in the pile just to get the weeds cleaned up before it gets shipped off, you could end up with all sorts of troubles, and it's hard to get out after you've got it sort of in there. So be careful of the types of materials you bring in, because you run into that all the time. People are mixing compost and they bring it in from somewhere and it's been sprayed, or it's composed of something that was sprayed in its past life, and that some of the stuff can hold on for a while.
Well, yeah, there's actually some products out there that will pass through the manure of cattle, say.
Oh, certainly.
And 3 or 4 years later, it still has an effect on plants.
And especially in the small, especially not in the small stuff, but in in some crops are really sensitive. Like tomatoes and potatoes are the most sensitive to the herbicides. Then you'd be kind of beans and some of the other stuff. And then if everything's showing up, then, well, you got problems. But I mean, be watching early on. If it was seedlings, you'd be watching for damping off and seed decay and seedling blights and things like that. And they'll kind of show up in pockets, and you'll often see, if you're seeing dripping, you'll often see, a little bit of, that's where the stuff will start, where it's extra wet and you're getting condensation raining down, and where the drip points are, that's where you'll probably start to see stuff. And then as things get older, you can get, salt stresses and nutrient deficiencies, or you can get some of the other problems that come with older stuff, some of the foliar diseases. And insect pests, I mean, certainly occur, but maybe if you're opening everything up and it's completely cleared out in the year to year, it's probably not going to carry too much. Just be careful of what you're bringing in. If you bring plant material in, maybe take a close look and make sure you're not bringing a bunch of critters in with it.
Yeah.
And then just keep an eye on things. Look
What's
under
the sanitation leaves from year to year? Like once you're finally taking everything out that you went to in the fall?
Well, I mean, if you're taking the cover off, or if it's completely emptied out, I mean, brush it out, clean things out. I mean, most like commercial greenhouses will take all the stuff out. They'll hose everything down, then they'll sanitize, and they'll wash it, and then rinse it and everything, and try to clear everything out. Because just cold doesn't necessarily cut it.
Oh yeah.
For certain pests, but I mean, hobby
take
greenhouse,
out the crop residue as well.
Yeah, with a hobby greenhouse, you can probably get away with doing most of the, just clean up the debris, get rid of anything that you can in terms of, old spent junk and dump
Leaves
that, and then clean that kind of stuff up, and then just let it freeze hard, and you're probably going to be okay for the most part for most of what you face. And then if you start seeing problems, then learn a little bit more about them and find out if there are other things that need to be done to deal with them.
It's not quite as simple as people might think, is it?
No, not at all. And I mean, you're just adding, suddenly you have to sort of consider what I'm now trying to control light and temperature and humidity and all these other things that when I'm out in the garden, all I try to do is water, or make sure that, I hope that the sun shines and that kind of thing. And I might protect from the temperature extremes, but otherwise I'm not doing anything all that special. But in a greenhouse, especially as you move out of the soil into a soilless medium, suddenly you got to control everything. Yeah. And you can go too good you can go too far one way or not enough. And so
pretty narrow range, isn't it?
Yeah. But I mean, one of the things to learn is that it's fun, I guess, in learning. You make mistakes, but hey, it was a lot of fun. And nothing smells better than a nice, warm, humid greenhouse when it's bleak and cold outside and you go into a greenhouse and it smells like growing stuff. Nothing beats that, right? So, I mean, enjoy the journey.
With the spring or summer.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah. And
what about watering systems? Because I mean, you could water from the top.
Mm-hmm. And that's certainly the simplest, easiest way. I mean, make sure that you're not dousing the plants with freezing cold water. If you can, there's not a lot of way to control that, but just be careful that some plants are more sensitive to that. So be aware that they don't like. Some might shock a little more, but I mean, if you have a nice, gentle watering wand that gives a nice, soaking, but not like pounding spray of water. Yeah. I mean, and then just, be careful to get the edges and the corners and make sure that you're wetting things down well. Well, watering from above is fine. If you've got bigger pots and with bigger plants, it might make more sense to invest in like a drip system, like with drippers, individual drippers that you can just turn it on and let it wet just that root ball area. You can set up, it's easy enough even to set up just drip lines as well with just drippers in a line if you're in the ground or whatever. So there's lots of different options. And I mean, there's plenty of companies that'll help you set it up. And nice thing is a lot of the systems you can reuse. I mean, in a commercial system, they'll be flushing those lines regularly to try to prevent algae growth and other things, but they're using those things year round and they're pushing a lot of nutrients through. And if you're just pushing water through, you can probably get a fair bit of use out of them.
Right.
So I would say for the most part, water from the top with a good wand is fine, depending, and then I make adjustments depending for other crops. Like for me, I had some little mini greenhouses in my backyard on some raised beds, and I set up drip lines because I was growing in soil on the top of these beds, and I just had drip system so I could wet the whole surface.
Right.
And then for ones that weren't underneath there, didn't make a lot of sense to water anything but other than above. So I just watered them with the hose. And
they're both productive?
Yeah, very much so. Right. I mean, I got to work on, I'm not getting a lot of season extension out of that, but I learned a bit and I'm going to do it more.
Well, you told me that you'd actually grown some eggplants.
I did.
I
had eggplants. I had peppers, but the peppers came with the flowers already on them, and I had a lot of tomatoes. I mean, the eggplants weren't huge, and they weren't huge plants, but they were pretty productive. I got quite a lot of little golf ball sized eggplants. Like, I got dozens and dozens and dozens of them. So, and half the time I didn't even know they were there. They were just lurking underneath. They're kind of hidden, but I didn't push the fertilizer or anything on them. I didn't do any training. I mean, you can train up your plants as much as you want and sort of tie them up, have them on strings
trellises or whatever.
Trellises or on you have a line running from one end to the other, and then just let the plants grow up them, however you like to do it.
Okay.
It can control the space.
Is there anything else that haven't covered about greenhouses or?
I mean, you certainly get what you pay for. I mean, if you're serious about having a more permanent structure that's going to be in place, take the time to invest go to a company that might, go to look at what different companies have on offer and try to find one that fits, your budget and fits your area. Do the homework on all the pieces,
Right.
What can I get for this amount? I mean, recognize that, most stuff that you can buy at your local hardware store is probably going to just be a kit that will work for, a few weeks to a month or so. And then it's really not going to do much more than grow you some transplants. And that's about it. There's lots of information out there in terms of how to calculate things. If you're really serious and you want to, put a heating system in and other things, there's lots of ways to calculate exactly what you need. And if you're going to go to that trouble, talk to the company that's selling them and they can help you calculate all those pieces.
Okay.
And so you can get it in there.
Sky's the limit when it comes to price too.
It certainly is. Exactly. And I mean, recognize that over time, some materials you're going to have to replace, like coverings often have to replace, they do degrade over time. And so eventually you're going to have a reduction in quality. But I mean, I just used vapor barrier for my stuff. I had some left over and it worked okay. But I was only going for okay. And if I'd really wanted to get productive, I would have probably invested in something a bit better and done a better job of what fit. But
thank you very much, Rob. I really appreciate this information. And how can people get a hold of you again if they have questions?
I've got a website with all my contact information on it. It's spencer-hort-solutions.ca. And you can find me, or you can find me on social media under, Rob the Hort God, or the Spencer Hort Solutions. You can find that on Instagram or Facebook or whatever, but I'm just out and pretty easy to find. So.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Rob. I really appreciate that.
You're welcome.